Welcome, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu v'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And we are, of course, doing Torah T'mimah. And let me make sure I have what I need here. Let's see here. All right. So we actually need to go back to the page before. And we're really, really riffing.
By the way, we do have a minion.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. Okay. We're riffing on this statement that God makes to Abraham, where he says, I will establish my covenant between myself and your descendants. And between myself and you, and between your descendants after you, according to all generations, as an eternal covenant, to be your God, ולזרעך אחריך, and your seed following you. And this is the part this connection of liot lachal Elohim, to be your God and your seed after you. By the way, of course, when we say the Shema, right, we say Adonai Eloheinu, which in some ways is a reference to what we're saying here, and the connection that we have to the divine creator, right? But the fact that these two ideas are put next to each other, and I think the fact that it's repeated, Zarcha Acharecha, is up here as well, that we have to give additional meanings to this particular statement here, and the fact that it's connected to be your God. So here we are. ולזרעך אחריך. כל מי שאינו עוסק בפריה ורבייה. So anyone, I will put parenthetically, who is capable of engaging in procreation, right? Gorim l'Shechina, causes for the divine presence, shetistalek miYisrael, that it should remove itself from the Jewish people. Shinemar, as it says, liot lachal Elohim ulazaracha archarecha, to be your God and to your seed afterwards. Bizman shezaracha acharecha Shekhina shora. If you, in fact, have seed after you, then the divine presence is able to alight. Okay. Ein zaracha acharecha, but if there is no seed after you, al mi shoreh, on who is this divine presence going to rest? Al ha'itzim va'al ha'avanim, on the trees and on the stones. Okay. We have to, of course, always contextualize what these things are saying, and not to sort of just take them as declarative 100%, but understand we are talking about the circumstance and the general idea that if there aren't any Jewish people, then there are no Jewish people to try and bring this idea of a divine creator to the world and its implications. This is said so many different times in our prayers. Aleinu, the prayer Aleinu, is such an amazing statement of exactly what we're talking about, that the idea of having God's presence in the world can bring a time of a global happiness, right? Prosperity, health, people living in peace, etc., etc. Okay. So let's take a look here at what's going on. So again, based on this particular passage, and it's from Yevamot. Let's take a look, double check, right here. Yevamot Samach Dalad Aleph. So that's Yevamot, page 64a. Okay. So here we are. Hagriv b'sefer She'ilat Shalom. So the Griv, right, is here. I made some notes about it. Judah ben Yoshua Chezkel Bakarak, right, lived 1775 to 1846. Question? Okay, all right. So here we go. Rabbi Talmudist of Betin Agassani, Suwalki Government, known for his glosses in the Babylonian Talmud. So we see this, and it's called Gil, I believe, I'm not sure if this is also Gil Yonei Hashas, but we'll see. I think he's meant. But this is a book he wrote, right? She'ilat Shalom, right? Looking forward, requesting peace, literally, or I would say a desire for peace. And apparently this is a book that he wrote that was organized according to the Sedras, the Torah portions of the weekly Torah portions. Possibly it contains his sermons, maybe, right? But Vayera, so that's the Torah portion. Vayera, of course, is the next Torah portion after Lech Lecha. We're looking at Lech Lecha now, and the next portion anyway. Heir, so there he clarifies, Lama Mevi Hagemara, the question as to why the Gemara, why the Talmud, Davka Pasuk Zeh, why does the Gemara, the Talmud, in its discussions, bring this particular verse, Velo halshonot zaracha acharecha dichtiv adka, and that this is the first time that the Talmud mentions this concept and uses this verse to prove the concept, and doesn't use previous verses that also have this phrase zaracha acharecha, that have your seed following you. So I hope you understand the question that he's asking. He's saying it doesn't seem to make sense that the Talmud should wait to this particular point in order to bring up this idea, and doesn't use earlier examples of where the Torah uses this phrase, Zaracha acharecha, your seed following you, right? Because the idea of your seed following you totally throws in the idea of making sure that there is seed following you. And he gives examples. Kamor beParshat Noach, right? It says in Parshat Noach, it's a parsha actually that precedes Lech Lecha, Zarachem Acharechem. It uses this phrase, Zarachem Acharechem, your seed following you. And it goes on to say, V'hakimoti et briti beini uveinecha uvein zaracha acharecha. Right? That also is in Parshat Noach, right? I shall establish my covenant between me and you, and between your seed after you. This is the covenant that God made with Noah, right? And likewise, v'natati lacha ulazaracha acharecha. And again, there it says, I shall give to you and your seed following you, right? And again, et briti tishmor, you shall guard my covenant, ata v'zarcha acharecha, right? And says this earlier on in this particular parsha. Ye'uyan Sham, he says, take a look at the Griv's book, Shilat Shalom, and you'll see how he raises this particular question. But he says, the Torah T'mimah says, but it seems obvious to me and clear that kevan de ikar halimud kan, that because in this particular case, what are we trying to learn out here? What is the essence or the essential teaching that we're trying to deal with here? Hu le'inyan hashra'at Shekhina. Because here, it's not just a matter of establishing a covenant. The issue is the placing of the divine presence, right? The presence of the divine. And he learns this out, midichtiv, because it says explicitly, liot lacha Elohim, to be for you as a God. Imkain, and if this is the case, behechrech, he's forced, tzarich lilmod rak mipasuk zeh. He has to learn only from this particular verse, davka, velo mizulato, and not from any other verse, because it says that liot lachal Elohim. It doesn't say that. It says, I'll establish my covenant, but it doesn't say to be your God. And so thinking about what does that exactly mean, and we've discussed this before to try to understand exactly what that means, right? And we're talking about the divine presence alighting on someone. Now, sometimes that, or I'd say maybe very often, we have to do with an idea of prophecy. But I have to say that for me, it's somewhat of an open question to think about as to what exactly do we mean when we're talking about the divine presence resting on someone, and what is the Talmud trying to teach us and convey to us here. So, Kevan, he goes on with the argument. Kevan de rak bokativ ilahut. Why? Because here in this particular phrase, it says explicitly the idea of God. Now, I want to clarify that this, as has become clear to me, and this has taken a long time for me to work out, that when we talk about God is our God, and I've mentioned this, right, that we are talking about the relationship that we have with God, and that basically comes down, essentially it has to do with the idea of performing divine commandments. That there's a very special relationship that takes place in this idea that as human beings, we are given the privilege of actually performing divine commandments. Okay. And that's the idea of when we say Adonai hu Elohim, when we say the Lord, he is Elohim, we are talking about God manifesting God's self in through the commandments to us and our ability to practice them. This is not the case, but I think this is be'inach, right? In the other ones, lo nizkar shem Elohim. In those particular other verses, all those other verses, it doesn't mention the name Elohim. It doesn't say use that name for God. Velo ire be'inyan Elohut, right? It doesn't discuss the issue of God, right? Elohut. Rak b'netinat haaretz, right? It only mentions the idea of God when it comes to giving the land, uvemilah, and in the circumcision, ve'od yinanim shonim, and other kinds of issues. In other words, it may discuss God's relationship in giving us the land of Israel, or giving us the mitzvah of circumcision, but the idea of God being our God, right? Shonim ve'ein kol ra'aya mehem. So there is no proof from those other verses, the tachlit hanirtza midrasha zo, for the purpose that we are looking for in this particular interpretation, right? In other words, this idea of the divine presence resting on people. There are other things, other manifestations of the divine in the land of Israel, in the covenant of circumcision is the examples he gave us, but this idea of the divine presence resting, whatever that means, right, however we want to take that, is not mentioned in the other verses. So that's the point. All right, going on. Velazar'ach אחריך. And again, I told you we are riffing on this particular phrase. My acharicha, what do we mean when we say after you, your seed? It could have just said ulazaracha, right? It could have just said, and to your progeny and to your seed. What's acharecha adding? In other words, your seed after you. You don't mean your seed before you, right? So what does it mean? Acharecha, after you. Amar le HaKadosh Baruch Hu Avraham. So what this is telling us is that the Holy One, blessed be He, God, said to Abraham, Lo tenasiv kutit v'shivcha, you shall not marry, right, a Kutite or a shivcha or this is a maidservant, de lo lezal zarachecha batra, so that your seed does not get associated, or it should go off. In other words, as far as the genealogy is concerned, right? So, for example, we say that the status of the child follows the mother in a case where a Jew and a non-Jew have relations and provide seed, right? So if a Jewish woman has relations with a non-Jewish man and she bears a child, that child is going to be considered Jewish. The reverse, the child is not considered Jewish. And that's what they're talking about here. So in other words, saying that this acharecha, right, needs to go, that if we look at this as a commandment, God is saying to Abraham, make sure that your progeny can have the status of you, follow your status. That's how they're understanding this particular verse. Let's take a look at what he has to say here. Kaf Gimel, right here. Kemivu'ar beKiddushin, right? So as is clarified in the tractate Kiddushin, Samachet Beit, page, this is 68b, Al HaPasuk, regarding the verse, the Parshat Va'etchanan, in the Parsha in the Torah of Va'etchanan, that's in Deuteronomy, Ki yasir et bincham echarai, for he will turn away your children from following me, from, right? Remove your children from after me. Bincha haba bin ha-Yisrael, right? So this is saying that your son who comes, understanding what this means, who comes from a Yisraelit, karui bincha, that can be called bincha, your son. Ve'ein bincha haba min ha-Nochrit karui bincha. However, your son who comes from a non-Jew cannot be called your son. Ella b'na, it's going to be called her son. Ye'uyan sham. Look there, check it out. Lefanenu, ahead of us, beparshat ve'etchanan. So obviously the Torah Temimah has comments on Parshat ve'etchanan. Ulekaman, and later on also Parshat Vayera. That's the next parsha that's coming up. Bepasuk shvu lachem po im hachamor, where this is right before the Akedah, where the binding of Isaac, and where Abraham says to the servants, sit, remain here with the donkey. Uvarosh Parshat Mishpatim, at the beginning of the Parsha of Mishpatim, that's in Exodus, it's the Parsha that follows Yitro, the giving of the Ten Commandments, the Pasuk, and in the verse that says, Ha'isha v'yiladeha, the woman and her children, right, her offspring. Ma shekatuv bazeh, what is written regarding this same general principle. Uma de parich bichlal, and in general, how, the fact that it's raising this objection. Parich means to sort of break up an argument. My acharecha, in other words, why is it asking this question of what do we mean by acharecha, right? Why is the need for this particular word? Afalpi, despite the fact, shebidrasha delael, despite the fact that in the previous comment we read about, right, darshinan ota, we did use the acharecha, right, the inyan havchana, right, regarding the issue of being able to determine the status of the child, right, Yein mashakatuv lael, right, see what is written above at the end, Sof Ot Kaf Aleph, at the end of note 21. He's referring to these numbers here, So I realize, again, I'd say it's not infrequently necessarily that we come to things that are difficult for us. These are not easy, these are not concepts that fit easily with, with our own sense of what's right and what's wrong. And, obviously in those situations, that my approach is to try and see if there are ways in which to interpret these things so that we either contextualize it or can find applications that work a little bit better. So I'm happy at this point since we're going to the next verse, let me leave this here, and I'm going to stop the share and invite you to comment if you want. Do you have any thoughts? Lauren, I would think you'd have something to say about this.
Well, I mean, I think it's just the same old, they're
It's
just
harsh
talking
stuff.
to,
Yeah.
they're talking to men, not
Yes,
to
they are.
women.
Well,
And of course, they're saying the father can't count his child as his child. And of course, they always do.
when you say they always do, what exactly do you mean
Well,
by
if a
that?
father, I mean, they don't always, but,
Always
but
is an
generally,
emotional word. Yes, go on.
no, I mean, I know a guy who has lots of kids and doesn't have relations with all of them. But I mean, a healthy, optimal family the father's going to count all his children equally.
Hmm. Well, again, I'd rather like to look at this whole thing in general and talk about, we have in the V'ahavta, it says, V'shinantam levanecha, right? You shall teach your children diligently. And
Hmm.
and we know from Abraham, we learned this before, that the one thing Abraham was afraid of was not having any children to begin with, right? Not having any children. And not only that, not being able to transmit. And why, I mean, that begs another question. Why was he so worried about not having children. Obviously, he was worried because he was advanced in age, and Sarah was no longer having periods, and so the chances of them having a child seemed slim to none. Okay, but in and of itself, that's not enough of a reason. The idea is that he had something he wanted to share in terms of his relationship with the divine. That being able to discover this particular aspect of human existence was then not being able to pass that on was something that bothered Abraham. It scared him a lot. At least that's the way we understand when God.
So he had relations with a non-Jew, and it's saying Ishmael doesn't count as his son.
Well, he doesn't count in the same covenant that Isaac does, right? Because it says it specifically, "B'yitzchak yikareh lecha zera," your seed shall be called through Isaac. But again, I'm glad we're discussing this because even though it says that, I think it's rather a matter of emphasis because we know that Abraham actually had a lot of other children as well. That after Sarah died, he married Keturah, which we understand was Hagar. The tradition understands that Keturah, who's mentioned by that name, is actually Hagar, and that he had 10 other children with her, so that Abraham winds up with 12 children as well. And these are, not explicitly stated in the Bible, but my own sense of that is to give us an opportunity to expand the message here. In other words, all these people, all these children and their subsequent offspring would have had some relationship to Abraham. And look, I think naively, I think that were we to be more open and to certainly other religions and other ideas, especially if they have values that are uplifting and show compassion. And basically, I love Hillel's principle of if they all basically articulate what is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. We're all part of one family. I mean, that's the whole idea. And it's not, I don't see things as that everyone has to be converted to Judaism. I don't think that that's necessarily what's so important. What I think is important is that we all act with that principle of what is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. And I've said this before because I know for a fact that in the course of my life, I have learned incredible lessons from other religions. So
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
it would be nice if all religions were based merely on philosophies and not ethnicities and genetics, and that people could just choose to believe what they want to believe. I mean, they can be raised one way and they can choose that way. I mean, I'm not saying parents shouldn't raise their children as Jewish or Christian or Muslim, but, you know, that it should be easy if your heart believes something to kind of align yourself that way, no matter your genetics or ethnicity. I mean, I don't like the peoplehood aspect because it's so nationalistic and I think that's causes a lot of problems.
Well, you know that I consider nationalism a type of idolatry anyway. Okay. But on the other hand, to me, I love the fact, one of the things I love about living here where I do in California is that there are so many different ethnicities around. And just because they're different doesn't mean that one has to feel in competition or to look down on them or anything like that. And I felt honestly, I love this. There's a midrash that sort of basically says that when a human king mints coins, they all look identical, but when a divine king mints coins, they all look different. And so the way I understand that is the fact that there are so many different ethnicities and ways of doing things, as long as they basically have that principle of respect for one another, I think it's a sign, to me, it's a glorification of God. The fact that there are so many different ethnicities and cultures is something I think, to me, that's a manifestation of the divine. So it depends on how you look at these things. You can take anything practically, and if you want to try and make it a way in which to become competitive in a negative sort of way, right? You can. That depends on where your heart is. But if you want to look at this and say, wow, it actually is something amazing and wonderful, you can. Just like this material that we're doing right now. We can use this material to put down other people, etc. Or we can use this material to say, this tells you that as you go through life, you need to think carefully about what the major focus is going to be. So that's the way I prefer to look at this thing. And you know, I don't hide, I don't try to neutralize the parts that are challenging, like what we did today. I mean, for me, reading what we just read today is challenging, but I don't feel it takes away its validity or its holiness, for me, it just means I need to look at it and try to understand it in a way that will blend legitimately with my overall beliefs. And my overall belief is that God created human beings, not just Jews, but human beings in the divine image. So, so with that, I'm going to stop the recording.